My name is Sun Jun-young, professor at the University of North Korean Studies and former ambassador to the United Nations. It is my honor to preside over the session 2 of today's forum titled The Prospects for Economic Reform in North Korea and International Development. I would like to let you know, the panelists on the podium, that you will have each around 15 to 20 minutes, and so that we can have interaction between the podium and the audience later on. First of all, I would like to invite Professor Robert Carlin, who is a visiting scholar at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, with a research interest in U.S.-North Korea relations. Professor Carlin.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here and the first speaker after lunch. And the ripple of response to that tells me that I'm in big trouble. My task specifically is to look at the North Korean relationship and refusal to join the Soviet-centered economic institution, Komikan, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then try to project a little bit into the future why they didn't, and what, if anything, that tells us about their view of integrating into the international economic community today. In doing this, I had some of these wonderful documents from the Wilson Center. I did a little bit of my own research to find something a little more current, and I came across a May 2006 article in the North Korean Economic Journal, Kyungjae Yongu. 2006 may not sound exactly like the present day to some of you, but it's to someone my age, that's just yesterday. Anyway, I'm going to read a little bit of this. It's not very, I'm going to read just an excerpt from it. I got to warn you, recently I have been reading stories to my beautiful and brilliant 10-month-old grandson. And so if I drop back into the cadence of Pat the Bunny or Good Night Moon, you'll have to excuse me. Anyway, here goes. The modern revisionists who emerged in the international communist movement put a brake on our party's, North Korean, our party's self-reliant national economic construction line by abusing the mission of Komikan. These revisionists maintain that the countries other than such big countries as the Soviet Union cannot build a advanced and comprehensive economy, and that they should develop only the economically and geographically most advantageous domains. Then, when such a theory and line they put forth was not accepted by our party, they slandered and hurled abuses at our party's self-reliant socialist economic construction line as a nationalist tendency and as isolationist from the general socialist regime. Okay, so this is 2006. This is a North Korean article talking about development of the North Korean economy, and it's going back to talk about things that most of us don't have any concept what in the world is he talking about, and why would he be even raising it. So I decided to see how I could connect something like this to these documents. Take a historical stroll back and see if there are lines that connect these things. And lo and behold, August 1962, a report from the Hungarian embassy in Pyongyang to the Hungarian Foreign Ministry. And what does it say? It says this Hungarian diplomat was talking to what he says is one of his, a close Korean friend of mine. This is the sort of thing that in cables is wink, wink, nod, nod. I can't tell you who it is, but he's really close to me. And it says, according to information, the North Korean press published only a short piece of news about the latest Kamikon session that had been held in Moscow. And it did not publish the document on the basic principles of international division of labor. Well, if you'll remember, 2006, this man is talking about how people had tried to force North Koreans to accept this international division of labor. And then he says, the press and party education do not study the issues of international division of labor, and according to certain pieces of information we received, this issue is often branded a revisionist one. So there's that term revisionist being thrown around in the context of this Kamikon problem. Now you go to January 1965, again the Hungarians. And they note a fascinating and actually quite hilarious meeting between the North Koreans and Kosygin. And the North Koreans are in very bad temper and complaining to the Russians, and the Russians are pushing back. And at one point, the North Koreans say, Khrushchev had big power ambitions. He, as the leader of a big power party, wanted to force his will upon the smaller parties, Kim Il-sung said. The Korean leaders, pursued an independent policy. One could not make them go out of their way by putting pressure on them. The policy, here's Kosygin. The policy of economic isolationism. Economic isolationism. This is what this economic journal said the North Koreans were accused of, and here's Kosygin saying, the policy of economic isolationism, which was in practice aimed at isolation from the Soviet Union, by no means accelerated the development of the DPRK's national economy. We made no secret that there are problems in Kamikon, and we will solve them, but one had to take into consideration that this organization was in essence important for, in fact crucial for, the economic cooperation of the socialist countries. So what are the Soviets doing here? The Soviets are telling the North Koreans that your isolation from Kamikon is actually an anti-Soviet move. Okay, fast forward 1972. Kim Il-sung is talking to Lee Hoo-rak, the head of the KCIA. This is at a moment of, a very unusual moment when the head of the KCIA is in Pyongyang. And he's talking to Kim Il-sung. They've just started their dialogue. And Kim Il-sung says, during Khrushchev, we were asked to join Kamikon, but we turned down the offer. If we merely export resources, we'll only be left with abandoned mines. You must import our machines. We want machine versus machine and resource versus resource trade. That is why we didn't join Kamikon. In other words, he's making an economic argument here for not joining the organization. And there's at the end of this, we'll get to the question of, was that eyewash? Did the North Koreans really have an economic motivation, or did they have a political motivation? Well, the next year, 1973, Kim Il-sung is talking to the head of the Bulgarian Communist Party, Comrade Zhivkov. And as far as the North Koreans were concerned, when they talked to Zhivkov, they were whispering in the ear of the Soviet Union. They figured Zhivkov was in Brezhnev's pocket, so talk to him, you're talking to the center. And therefore, they're very, very careful what they say And Kim Il-sung says some very flattering things about Brezhnev because he knows Zhivkov will probably pass them on. And then Zhivkov raised Kamikhan. Comrade, think about it. Soviet Union helped you a lot. Kamikhan's extremely important. You ought to think about joining it. And Kim Il-sung says, he understands the issue. He knows the Soviet Union has helped. Then Zhivkov says, but he did not give a specific answer to my proposal that the DPRK engage more closely. He pointed out that they had an observer at Kamikhan, and then he turned to one of his own delegation, and he said they needed to discuss the issue further. Now this is like shooting the horse in the head in diplomatic terms. We have to talk about this some more among ourselves, comrade. We don't disagree with you. We're not saying no. We're going to talk about this some more. And then Kim, in a very slippery way, says this economic integration among the socialist countries that already exists is a really good thing because it gives the DPRK, in turn, an opportunity to cooperate with socialist countries on a bilateral basis. In other words, I'm not going into Kamikhan. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But you have a good idea there. Okay, what do we see? This is a pretty small sample, but what do we see of this and what do we project into the future? First of all, those of you who haven't looked at the Wilson Center documents, I urge you with every ounce of my being to do so. It's a wonderful voyage of discovery. You will discover things about North Korea you never imagined, and it will challenge your own assumptions. So go ahead and do it. Secondly, it's a primer and a validation of the methodology of analyzing North Korean public statements. It's very clear from these documents that what the North Koreans say in public and how they perceive what other people say in public is very important in leadership decision-making. And it'll be a good education. What does it tell us about the future, though? That's sort of the question of the moment. Well, when I was in negotiations with the North Koreans, and I was from 1994 to about 2000, a constant theme from them when we would ask them, for example, one point we asked them to join the missile technology control regime, and their answer to us was, no, we're not going to join the MTCR. But they said, go ahead and tell us what you want us to do. Pick those points out of MTCR you want us to follow, adhere to, and we'll talk about that. We can do that, but we're not joining any more international organizations like IAEA. What all this meant was, my interpretation was that they're not comfortable joining any international organizations which in their view impinge in any way on their sovereignty. There's a direct line here going back to their views on Kamikhan, in my estimation. It's almost as if their concern about Kamikhan and their concerns about domination by the Soviet Union and interference has morphed over the years into this more generalized concern about international organizations that have some say in what they do. This has direct implications for I believe it has direct implications for their integration into international economic organizations. They're very interested in having the IMF and the World Bank come and look. If they would sign a check when they left, that would be good. But actually, becoming enmeshed in this international economic financial world is something that they almost have a genetic repulsion toward. Now, will they ever overcome that? They are becoming, by degrees, a little bit more accustomed to dealing with the outside world. In some ways, they're pretty sophisticated about it. I think they calculate each time. That's why they went into the agreed framework and joined Keto. They would have to see the benefits far outweigh from what, in their view, are these very serious downside of these organizations. And at this point, I don't see that that balance is such that they'd want to take that leap.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Carlin. Now I would like to invite Professor Nicholas Eberstadt, who is the Henry Wendt Scholar in the Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, and he is the author of many monologues and articles on North and South Korea, among other countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's great to be here at the Wilson Center. I'm going to talk in the next few minutes about the DPRK's economic performance over the past 2 generations and about the prospects for new directions in North Korean economic policy. But before I do, I want to go through what I call reading the Miranda rights to the DPRK. Some of you have heard me do this before. Please bear with me. I'm not doing this just for fun. There are reasons that we don't understand the DPRK better than we do today. And 3 I'd like to just lay out immediately. The first is that the DPRK as a government operates in a universe which has coordinates that are intuitively unfamiliar to us. We're all creatures of the Enlightenment or postmodernism or something like that, and understanding how a system which brings a Marxist-Leninist organization in fusion with a hereditary Asian dynasty, it's hard for us to understand. Another thing makes the DPRK hard to understand, and that's the data famine that continues to this day. The DPRK, I believe, is the only government on earth at the moment that has never published a statistical yearbook. It has published a little bit of data from one time to another, but information is remarkably restricted to this day, which leads to a third problem, which is the hardly trivial question of strategic deception. Perhaps more than any other government on the face of the planet today, the DPRK makes its living off of deliberately attempting to mislead outsiders about its strengths and its weaknesses and its objectives and its strategies. The surprise attack in June 1950 was not the last example of North Korean strategic deception. When you put all those things together, you can see why observers of the DPRK can pick from the limited set of things we think of as facts and come up with diametrically opposite interpretations. So what I'm going to give you today is an interpretation based on limited data availability. That being said, I think that we have adequate reason to suggest that the DPRK is the single worst example of economic performance in modern global economic history. We've seen a spiral downward in economic performance in the DPRK, which puts Argentina, or pick your other country, in the shade. In the 1950s and 1960s, the DPRK was a rapidly industrializing Soviet-style economy. Until perhaps the mid-1970s, some people will debate about the exact year, there's little doubt that the DPRK was a more productive system in terms of output per capita than the South Korean economy. It's amazing for young people to hear this today because it sounds so absolutely impossible given our current perspective. But there's really little doubt about that, historically speaking. By the 1990s, the DPRK had accomplished something that no other system on Earth had ever accomplished, which is to say, a mass famine for an urbanized, literate population during peacetime. Never been done before. Difficult, but not impossible. So, how did this awful devolution of North Korean economic performance come about? There are different hypotheses about this. If you listen to some North Korean sources, the end of the Soviet bloc was the critical trigger in this. It's certainly plausible, but not entirely convincing. There were other Asian states that were heavily dependent upon Soviet bloc largesse at the time. We didn't see famine come out of them. I'm thinking of Vietnam in particular. Vietnam went on a very different path after the end of the Cold War from DPRK. So what happened in North Korea? My interpretation would be this. Although often people talk about the DPRK as an unchanging system, we can see big changes in North Korean economic policy from the early 1970s to the end of the Cold War and thereafter, which is to say, during the period we might also trace to Kim Jong-il's ascendancy to power, perhaps by coincidence. All of these changes are likely, if not guaranteed, to bring about awful economic performance. Let me mention just a few of these. The first is the shift to what we might call planning without facts, the elimination of statistical information from a Soviet-style planning system. It's a recipe for trouble. The second thing that we can note is the shift towards from militarization to hyper-militarization, towards something close to full war planning status, towards almost a World War II level of mobilization. Very expensive to continue for decades on end. The third thing we might mention is the war against the consumer. All Soviet-type economies run a war against their consumers, but North Korea probably gets the gold medal here. It went further in demonetizing its economy and taking the money-linked choices out of consumer control than any other economy in the modern era this side of Pol Pot. Okay. Also a recipe for long-term trouble. Then there's the idea of food self-sufficiency, which came into vogue in North Korean planning. For some reason, starting in the 1970s, it seems that North Korean planners would purchase no more food from abroad than they were able to sell in terms of agricultural products to outsiders or foreigners. For a densely populated Northeast Asian economy, this is asking for trouble. Then number 5 is the matter of avoiding imports of capital equipment, of machinery and technology from abroad. Bob just mentioned something about that economic integration, and those fears are very real for North Korean leaders with regard to sovereignty. However, everywhere in the world, there has been a rising share of machinery and technology, machinery, equipment, technology imports in the national import bill over the post-war era. It's true for the United States, it was true for China, it was even true for the Soviet Union. The reason for this predilection for foreign equipment in local import bills was that foreign equipment could reduce production costs and improve productivity. So DPRK, by rigidly refusing this, guaranteed that it would have a high-cost, low-productivity industrial infrastructure, and it took 40 years to put that into place. Reaped the results from this. Number 6, there is the allergy to trade that developed. DPRK wasn't always allergic to trade. The defiant refusal to pay foreign debts. There was always a hint of this. We see some very illuminating discussions of this from the Wilson Center's archive materials on the Soviet bloc. DPRK wasn't paying its debts to its socialist brothers back in the good old days, but this became a more dramatic pattern in the 1970s and 80s. And all of this led naturally enough to catastrophic economic failure. I mean, you can see how all of this would. The DPRK did experiment with economic change from time to time. The 2002 experimentation is perhaps the one we're most familiar with, but for various reasons, the 2002 experiment ended as a big failure. In 2009, the government took back the limited monetization it had permitted in 2002, and here we are today. Now, over the last year, there have been some extremely unusual and I think quite interesting signs in North Korean policymaking that deserve considerable attention because they are so different from the trend of policies I've described to you in the past few minutes. For one thing, after avoiding the opportunity for well over a decade, the DPRK picked up its country code, Internet country code, from ICANN, from the International Corporation for Addresses, Names, and Numbers for the Internet. I think the DPRK was the last country to do so, I believe. I think Mauritania had already done so. But this was a significant change for the DPRK. Number 2, the DPRK agreed to implement a domestic cell phone system with the assistance of the Egyptian corporation Orascom. At this point in time, I believe there are more than 600,000 domestic subscribers to the domestic cell phone network, and Orascom is hoping that it will get up to 1 million. This is very different from anything before. This is I talk with my friends in telecom, and they say, what's the big deal about having 1 million subscribers in a country of 20-some millions? It's a huge big deal for a country like DPRK. Number 3, the DPRK unveiled a 10-year economic program earlier this year, which is supposed to take that country, in its own words, to the rank of the advanced economies by 2020. And whispers and rumors suggest that at least 10 major projects are envisioned within this plan, that the total cost of these investments might exceed $200 billion for a country that's earning maybe $3 billion a year in legitimate export revenues. This is a huge change. Related to this program has been the unveiling of a relationship with an international corporation, the Taepeng Group, a lot of commerce in China. I think perhaps Dr. John Pak is going to talk about some of the new developments with China on our panel. But all of this takes North Korea in some significantly different directions from the dead end that has been pursued for the last 40 years in association with Kim Jong-il's rise. Now, where is all of this going to go? I can't really tell you. I guess we'll have to stay tuned. But there are a couple of very important internal contradictions that we will want to follow. The first has to do with the official view of the legitimacy of profit in the North Korean system. Up until more or less yesterday, the DPRK government took the posture that allowing the foreign bastard to make a penny in the country was just this side of national treason. Needless to say, that's not a very promising disposition for encouraging international economic commerce. Will that disposition change fundamentally and dramatically? Stay tuned. We will want to see. That's going to have a great deal to do with how future economic directions unfold in the DPRK. Secondly, will the DPRK change its long-standing view about what is officially called ideological and cultural infiltration? The North Korean leadership has paid exceedingly careful attention in its homework to analyzing the downfall of the Soviet regime and Eastern European socialism. There have been enormous amounts written in North Korean media about the downfall of socialism in those areas. And again, these official expositions come back to the concept of ideological and cultural infiltration. And in the official diagnosis, the Soviet bloc governments fell because they became subject to ideological and cultural infiltration, which so corrupted the working classes that they no longer regarded the dictatorship of the proletariat as legitimate, and then everything, went terribly sad. To what is ideological and cultural infiltration? North Korean media explain very carefully in great detail. Cultural exchanges, foreign direct investment, international trade. All of this is what we would consider globalization, perhaps. Certainly, it is on the agenda for what we see in the 10-year plan in DPRK. Have North Korean leading circles decided that the society can withstand a little bit more foreign poison than they previously calculated? Are they correct in these calculations if they have made them? Stay tuned. We may find out in the years immediately ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Eberstadt. The next speaker is Dr. Kim Soo-hong, who is currently chair professor at the Gyeongnam University, and at the same time, the director of the Institute for Korea Peninsula Project Development. And he's also the CEO of the Incheon Bridge Corporations. He will speak on the subject of new approach to the inter-Korean economic development, which may be this is draft master plan or draft manual, which can be utilized in the future with necessary alterations, mutatis mutandis. So his presentation has the background of his long-time entrepreneurial experience with sometimes context with North Korea. So you will be using some simultaneous interpretation?
I'll speak English.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Dr. Kim.
Thank you very much. I want to introduce how we are going to deal with North Korea for the future, peaceful. And there's no doubt how important peace on the Korean Peninsula and stability in the Korean Peninsula is a fundamental for development of global economy. As you know, that 22% of world population, 18% of GDP of the world, and 48.78% of foreign exchange reserves in the world. there's no doubt deal with world safety and peace through the Korean Peninsula. Actually, this is a 2 days presentation. I have to go. And before I go detail, I want to introduce, we have to share what is project. If ask somebody what is project, then there's a lot of definitions. And I want to sort out what is project, and then we understand what is project management. I want to say project is the procedure, defined objective from the planning to completion. Like, let's say we are on the project, 30 years for the unification, 50 years unification. That's kind of project we are thinking of. But there is another project inside of project. We are deal with North Korea, 6-party talks, for example. To sort out the problems still today and until today, we are in a dilemma. We have to define that the stages for the 30 years project, for the dream of you and me, peace on Korean Peninsula. In order to do that, we have to figure that out. What is the factor of project? Then one project becomes next to projects, driving several projects. Then, this is mutual trust build up. Then probably we can build up other projects. It's project viewpoint. Core project, I say, starting viewpoint is very important, stage by stage upgrading for the one project, 30 years, 50 years, what is our dream is. Let's say now there are a lot of projects going on for peace on Korean Peninsula, but there's all different targets, all different ways. There are good drivers, but there's no expressway. We don't know where I go, what expressway I use, I don't know. But there are a lot of good drivers. We are going different ways. In order to sort out, we have to define that stage by stage, what is characteristic and what is target is. And what kind of method we are going to use to governing and control that. Then we sort out what is problem this moment from the beginning core project is. And if good planning and good completion, starting with the good project, which is I call core project. This is showing core projects actually will build up mutual trust. Without mutual trust, nothing going to happen. Whatever we talk, nothing going to happen. There is a lot of project going on discussing, but it's not going to happen. We don't have trust. We heard that many scholars worrying about North Korea, worrying about this and this and this. There's no trust between North and South. And of course, there's no trust between US and North Korea. We have to sort out those kind of problems through the core project, and then it'll go derivation to other projects, and then expand the other areas, and we are ready to discuss about unification for the future. Let's say 30 years, 50 years, 20 years. Here is 30 years project, and there is 2 stages, let's say. And each stage has the target, and those target is rotating. We cannot see the expressway and cars. That means factors. Then we are struggling to get to the target. That means we need a manual, common language, and the way of understanding each other. I choose that financing ways. Each project has 4 factors, actually: technical, financing, commerce, legal. And I want to choose the financing ways. That means we can use that common language for the benefit to the target. And North Korea will be happy to get the target, which is benefit, national benefit. We have to agree that core business, core project will produce benefit and sort out economic dilemma and South Korea problems to collaborate with the North Korea. So core project is very important, and using project management. And it drive to the other project, then we have to use the program management. We know that project management, but multiple projects, we don't know how to manage them. That's we call program management. And program management is possible to manage and control like core project as a 4 factors: technical, legal, commerce, finance. And we can make some kind of manual and metrics what we are going to do next step, and for the future we can see the vision, and there's a benefit. I want to get rid of whatever dangerous things for that target. We have a vision. Our generation and next generation will have the vision for the future, what we are going to get. There's no vision, then struggling 50 years, last 50 years. So we have to understand what the 30 years, 50 years as a project, and how to manage those, and for the future, for unification ready. If I see the benefit, big benefit, to get rid of nuclear plant, let's say, nuclear bomb, whatever, then how much size, how big size, what that is. Then we have to set up the target for the future. Maybe next generation, I don't know. But we need a manual. I don't want to change as a minister changes. We want that manual for next 30 years as a continuous ways. And this is the showing the way and how to manage and what is the benefit will be. So I say 3 stages. First stage, build up trust, mutual trust stages. And second stage, build up, expand, benefit stage. This stage will be understand each other. Like United States and South Korea understand each other. After maybe 50 years, we didn't understand each other. We had problems, but now we understand each other. Especially in financing ways, we are perfect. And after that, mutual policy exchange and cooperation stage will be ready to discuss about unification. Now, to make you understand, I want to make the example, what kind of project is possible. Don't laugh, but it's only example. Yeah? I thought about, we build the Las Vegas in North Korea. South Korea doesn't have to give the money. We have 20 million, 30 million tourists. We send them, and there is a way to invest. Investor will happy to build that hotels, Las Vegas ways, entertainment and convention, and a lot of projects. You know that Las Vegas, how big size it is. Macau, only 10 years old. It's a $28 billion last year revenue. We are better than that, if I do. No, but I can do better ways because we have a lot of competitive and tourists. And North Korea and South Korea has our own culture, our own entertainment ways, like K-pop, for example, South Korea, very famous. You don't know, but junior high school, they know. And North Korean performance is very famous, very unique. We can get together for the target of that. We can create those kind of businesses and project as a project expand to other projects like tourists to go to Pyongyang and back to the mountain. It's something like SOC project. SOC projects make it possible natural resources are feasible. 2030, $3,000 billion in natural resources. I don't know. I'm not specialist for that. But those kind of project expand to other areas. We're ready to discuss about unification for the future. To utilize method of approach is beyond ideology. We don't need that. I mean, actually, we have two faces to North Korea. One is North Korea is enemy of us, but they are our blood, family, relatives, brothers, cousins. We cannot get out of from that. But world want that peace on Korean Peninsula. That's what I want, what I dreamed. That's what Korea dreams. Establish stability and peace in Korean Peninsula by seeking method of coexistence by South and North Korea. And pass on the future generation a manual to Korean Peninsula which is stable, sustainable. Creation of relation between South and North which are integrated, sustainable, ever-growing. I want that our generation on peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Next speaker is Dr. John Park, Senior Program Officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And he will speak on the China-North Korea commercial activities. Dr. Park.
Thank you very much. My thanks to the organizers for the conference today. As the last speaker of the day, I used a lot of bright colors, so hopefully this will keep you tuned in. I wanted to take a different angle in looking at the topic of North Korea economic reform, prospects for economic reform and international development, and specifically from the angle of Beijing's sunshine policy with Chinese characteristics. As we've heard in the morning session, there's a tremendous amount of activity going on in the China-North Korea relationship. But perhaps this is one way that we can start analyzing how this came about and then look at some of the implications going forward. Before I do that, let me start with a disclaimer that these are my personal views and what I'm about to present doesn't reflect the views of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Going from macro to micro, I think here it's important to look at China's foreign policy principles, a refresher, not a shock or mystery. These are principles that have been reiterated time and time again by China on a host of foreign policy issues. The first is a non-intervention in internal affairs of other countries, a bedrock principle of China's foreign policy. Second is cooperation and participation in multilateral institutions. We've seen China now increase in terms of their activities on the international stage and in organizations like the UN, now as a member of WTO, China is very active. This is a background in terms of what China has done by way of developing China's 4 sentences. These are, I think, in many respects, the pillars of China's North Korea policy. The first, and these sentences were developed in around the 2003 period. The first, non-proliferation in Asia, is a message to North Korea. The second, peaceful settlement through dialogue, a message to the United States. At that time, we're coming out of Iraq. And the third, peace and stability on the peninsula, a message to all the parties involved. And the fourth, giving due consideration to North Korea's security concerns. The fourth sentence was later added mainly because at that particular point in time, North Korea was insisting on a security guarantee from the United States. And for a variety of reasons, it was not seen as a serious request. And from a Chinese perspective, this was very important and was formally added in terms of how they formulated their North Korea policy. This may all seem very basic, maybe even a little mundane, but if you recall China's diplomatic behavior during the 1994 North Korean nuclear crisis, this is a remarkable 180-degree shift. Then it leads to the question, why did they shift? If you look at the 1994 period, China was very discreet behind the scenes, encouraging the United States and North Korea to resolve the differences and work towards a peaceful resolution of the issue at hand. There are a host of different reasons, but the one that I wanted to focus on is Xiaokang, and this is the Chinese policy of moving the majority of their population into the middle class. And in order to do that, they really need two key things. The first is a stable external environment that will enable them to focus on sustainable economic development inside of China. And the second is extensive and deep relations with the United States, a key reference to avoiding any kind of costly competition with the United States during this very important formative development phase. Now, when we look at how this is being operationalized, I think the foundational piece is looking at trying to stabilize North Korea as the key component of the external environment for China. And the two means that China is pursuing right now, and I think has been gaining traction. The first is investing political capital from the Communist Party of China into the Workers' Party of Korea. The effects of that are harder to gauge. You know, we've seen a tremendous amount of the high-level visits both ways. But when we look at the second means, these are areas that we can track. And this is the development of the North Korean resource sector. And here I mean the iron ore mine, the coal deposits, and some of the copper mines, other rare earth elements that are required for economic development. This is something that requires a tremendous amount of startup capital, building of transportation infrastructure, and a lot of water, electricity as well. So these, again, are things that you can track. If you have access to Google Earth, these are things that over a time series, especially at nighttime, you can also see the evidence of the growing electricity in the border area where the Chinese are doing some of their activities. And as I mentioned before, not the only reason, but I think a very important one, this is geared towards facilitating that environment for China for that sustainable economic development. To some, this may seem as something of a policy of China to undermine the interests of other countries, but I think another way to look at it is just the fundamental tenet of players in the international system trying to maximize their national interests. There are key opportunities for the Chinese, and these efforts haven't been taking place overnight. There has been a concerted effort to lead to these different types of means, and only now are gaining some traction. So to dig a little deeper, and in the context of this conference, to present a little bit of the chronology, I won't go into that much detail, but just to highlight what I think are the important milestones in the party-to-party relationship, because this is certainly a unique relationship. October 1949 is when the two parties established diplomatic normalization. October will come up as a very important month where it gives something of a pretext for senior officials on both sides to meet. And on the sidelines of these meetings, talk about some very sensitive things. And I'll go into a little more detail how that's taken place in the contemporary time period. In October of 1950, with the Chinese entering the Korean War, the People's Volunteer Army, a tremendous amount of sacrifice. But this is, in retrospect, a very important landmark in terms of the bilateral relationship, in the sense that right now we're seeing a very strong Communist Party of China, CPC, effort to put the Chinese contribution to the Korean War front and center. When Premier Wen Jiabao visited North Korea in October of 2009, he insisted on visiting the Martyr Cemetery. The North Koreans came up with a host of excuses, reasons, the roads are bad and so forth. He kept on insisting. And he went and gave a very emotional speech. And it wasn't a speech designed for the audience members, but to the martyrs themselves. And the key phrase there was that, because of your sacrifice, we in China are living well. And so this linkage, direct linkage, that what China did in that time period directly facilitated this foundation for what eventually became China's economic reform efforts. Remarkable statement, and something that was largely overlooked outside of China. And I think this is something that is growing. The Korean War is being invoked time again. Vice President Xi Jinping also mentioned on one of the anniversaries the important bond that was cemented between the Chinese and the North Koreans, and how they essentially stopped the tide of Western imperialism. So this goes beyond something that I think is isolated and tactical, and fits into a larger strategy. And I'll go into more detail what that is amounting to. But with a lot of relationships, there are always formative experiences. And I think one of the important formative experiences for North Korea was August of 1992. And that is a time period where China and South Korea normalized diplomatic relations. I think one of the high points of South Korea's Nordpolitik, the northern policy approach that in an effort to try to create détente on the Korean Peninsula leads to essentially North Korea losing the preferential relationships with both the Soviet Union and China. This leads to a situation where North Korea denounces China for the Great Betrayal, and we almost see a lost decade in party-to-party relations. And it's also a time period that the North Koreans lose their security assurance from the Soviet Union. We saw the lapse of certain treaty obligations and also the end of the Soviet Union. So this is a very important time period for North Korea. A big part of North Korea research, the debate between coincidence and correlation. It's also during this time period that we see the very rapid activities at the Yongbyon facility and the North Koreans reaching out to the United States. But moving forward in terms of this party-to-party chronology, October of 2005 is when we see some remarkable changes in terms of not a senior Chinese party official visiting Pyongyang, but who she brings in her delegation. The vice premier at that time brought Commerce Minister Bo Xilai, who is currently a very leading senior party official, and some are speculating that he will make it into the 9-member Politburo and the next generation change. But this is where we see the beginnings of these Chinese-North Korean natural resource deals. And the Musan iron ore mine is something that starts in this time period. It's not a linear improvement, and it's something that the North Koreans and the Chinese are able to realize the benefits right away, but it is the beginning, and we see other types of deals come online. As I mentioned, October 2009 is when Premier Wen brings a delegation that I think by an American analogy is a cabinet-level delegation. The two key individuals in his delegation are the chief of the National Development and Reform Commission and the Commerce Minister, the two very architects of Chinese internal economic development. And they meet with their North Korean counterparts, and they come out with very innocuous-sounding economic deals under the headings of development, tourism, and education, but really is now the heading under which all of the commercial activity between the two countries are taking place. It's within this, I think, context that we can start looking at the Kim Jong-il visits, and there have been 3 of them so far. What exactly motivated the trips? There's some very compelling explanations out there, but I think we stand on more firm ground when we look at 2 key outcomes of these 3 visits. The first is the reference to Kim Jong-un as a rising generation of the party. The significance of that is Xi Jinping is also referred to as the rising generation of the party. And so you see this coordination in terms of the 2 parties going through their leadership succession process. And the second thing is the increasing build-out of the natural resource sector and the transportation links to these sites that also have important links to the port facilities. So suddenly these things that have been talked about, these economic development zone, natural resource mines and so forth, they're being catalyzed because of the access to these transportation hubs, but also increasing links to electricity. Now, if we're to graphically represent what is happening relative to the other countries, if we look at the commercial ties, inactive to active, and linkage to denuclearization, high to low, China in the 2-party approach, and they have 2 tracks, the 2-party and the 6-party, and the 2-party, they are on their own in terms of where they are vis-a-vis North Korea. Very active commercial activities, 0 linkage to denuclearization in the 2-party. It's not to say denuclearization isn't important, it's just that in this 2-party track, the priorities are aligned for China to focus on stabilizing North Korea through these economic development means. And with the other countries, I draw your attention to the United States. With the firm insistence on the resumption of the 6-party talks and any continuation or resumption of concessions linked to the resumption of denuclearization activities, it's quite clear where the United States is in terms of no denuclearization activity means no commercial economic activities. But it's this relative gap that is creating, I think, some very unique spaces for North Korea. In the specific area of Chinese state-owned enterprise on the provincial level, and the private Chinese companies that are doing more and more activities with North Korean state trading companies. Not only in North Korea and the border region, but increasingly North Korean state trading companies operating in the open on the Chinese side, especially in Beijing. So let me fast forward. I have a couple more slides. This is the photo of Premier Wen's delegation in October 2009. In Western media, the three gentlemen seated in the middle were the only ones depicted because no one knew who the other individuals were. But as I mentioned, this is the cabinet level type of delegation that is something of a game changer in terms of what has been happening between the two parties. From a Chinese perspective, the sustainable economic development part, here the priority is the development of the three Chinese provinces close to the North Korean border. These are among the poorest provinces in China, and for leadership that's going through a succession process and keen on maintaining social stability, the increasing gap between the poor and the rich in China is a challenge. And this is something where you see how this factors in, and the access to North Korean natural resources and energy resources is a key component of realizing some of these economic development goals. Now, going from the macro to the micro, Beijing's sunshine policy with Chinese characters. The Chinese don't call it sunshine policy, but they clearly were very strong supporters and admirers of what South Korea did with their sunshine policy. But the characteristics are different. And the first Chinese characteristic is that it's much brighter than South Korea's sunshine policy. There's the entire border region. It is the entire mineral resource sector in North Hamgyong province bordering Jilin province. As the Chinese would point out, this pales in comparison to the Kaesong industrial complex and the Kumgan tourism site, where if you visit them, they look like prison complex in terms of being completely fenced in. What the Chinese are doing much larger scale. The second characteristic is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the North Korean state trading companies and those that are tied to the elites, frankly, are operating more openly in the Chinese side. And this is seen as a very important way to let them learn commercial activities and other economic development benefits. But frankly, how the money is made, how it's sent over, the monitoring, that really doesn't seem to be a big factor. The third characteristic, the whole notion of the CPC investing the political capital into the Workers' Party of Korea, the actual operational piece is that the CPC is doing institution building of the Workers' Party of Korea. And this is, I think, the result of very thorough Chinese assessments that the North Koreans aren't capable of doing economic reform and economic development. And so the type of activities almost look, in some instances, like provincial reconstruction teams, where the Chinese teams that go over are doing the managerial part of the activities, bringing in the investment, and also hopefully some training. But in the immediate priority being stability, a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the Chinese side. The fourth characteristic, as I mentioned earlier, no direct linkage between this type of activity with North Korean denuclearization. The Chinese are serious and they're worried about the nuclear activities, but they frame that as the priority and the purpose of the six-party talks. But in approaching the two-track, I think an unintended consequence of this is that it de-emphasizes the importance for the North Koreans of the six-party talks. If you're looking at it from a North Korean perspective, why would you go back to the six-party talks, commit to denuclearization for uncertain economic concessions when you can go through the two-party route, get the concessions right away, have the Chinese build out some of these resources, and whatever obligations, and those are not particularly transparent right now, perhaps are deferred later down the road. The last characteristic, I would say, is the fact that for the Chinese, there's no time limit. It's not as if the CPC will be voted out of power, and we'll see the type of 180-degree shift in South Korea's approach dealing with North Korea. Moving to the impact for prospects for North Korea's economic reform and development. The key point here is that the activities that are happening are not a result of ideology, of purely politics. There are synergistic relationships here. You have tremendous deposits of North Korean natural resources. You have Chinese investment and equipment. The synergistic combination is very unique, and it's something that is being operationalized at a very fast rate right now. Now, when you look at the impact, as I mentioned earlier, the PRT, the Provincial Reconstruction Team-like activities, is largely a function of stability being the priority right now. Denuclearization is important, but if you were to look at it as some kind of equation or a symbolic representation, S is larger than D right now. And it's also the Chinese assessment that having looked at North Korean activities after their own economic reform efforts, the turbulence that came after the economic reforms were beyond the capabilities of the North Koreans. All the more reason why I think the Chinese are taking a very comprehensive, hands-on approach to all this. Let me wrap up with 3 key points. The first is, if we look at the broader picture in all this, the Chinese are very careful in pointing out that their North Korea policy is a part of a 2-pillar approach, and that the overall approach is a balanced Korean Peninsula approach, that they won't favor one Korea over the other, and they won't choose one Korea over the other. Their interpretation of how the events of 2010 went down was that China was put in this position of having to choose, and they won't do that because they feel that that will lead to instability on the Korean Peninsula more in the medium term. In the short term, it may hopefully address some of the concerns at hand, but the Chinese are very focused on the medium term. In this respect, their behavior can be categorized as PRC, please remain calm, which is what one of my colleagues in Washington refers to the Chinese activities of last year. But when we look at the increasing commercial activities between the two parties, under the heading of education, tourism, and development, another PRC comes up, and that's profit equals revenues minus costs. And while there are, I think, continuing difficulties in trying to evaluate and understand the direction of the North Korean regime, there are some very brutal realities for the regime in the sense that they have to be able to make money on a recurring basis. The party, the military, there is no national budget. This isn't a normal trading country. There are no national accounts that can sustain the type of posture that the regime would like to have. So the relationships with the Chinese partners at very different levels, from provincial all the way up to the top level, helps the North Koreans maximize the P part of this equation. And the last point I would mention is that all of the activities related to the two parties are happening in the broader context of an international application of financial sanctions. So if you look at the unintended consequence of financial sanctions, you see more and more North Korean state trading companies doing their activities on mainland China. And also you see private Chinese companies coming out of the woodwork demanding larger and larger commission fees to do the activities because they're cognizant that North Korean entities are being sanctioned. But here, if we look at this context of profit equals revenue minus costs, it's no surprise the North Korean economy is a militarized economy. And I think as a part of that, one of the reasons why we see a lot of the military connections to the succession process, Kim Jong-un being appointed a 4-star general, I think another way to look at it, not to say this is the only way, but another way to look at it is if you want to be the head of one of these large North Korean military state trading companies, to be a CEO is to be a 2-star general or 4-star general. And so Kim Jong-un, and the host of other positions and activities that he's being groomed to overtake, taking over this militarized economy is an important one. And I think the next step that we'll see in the China-North Korea relationship is institution building in the PLA to KPA relationship. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. We have heard 4 outstanding speakers. I once again thank them for your presentation. Now, the floor is open for any questions or comments from the floor. Yes, Mr. Chia.
Yafeng Xia, fellow at Wilson Center. My question is to Nicholas Bernstein and John Park. It's about China's role in North Korea's economic life, I would say. One scholar said that China has no leverage over North Korea, but China has a hammer, which, if China preferred to use, could strike North Korea to unconsciousness and collapse. But we all know that China will not use this hammer. Now, what's your comment on this statement? That do you think that China has such an important role in in the survival of the North Korea regime? Thank you.
As John showed, there were some big changes in Chinese policy towards DPRK in the year 2005, after the six-party talks had commenced and continued a bit. There's still despite the assiduous work of people like John, there's still an enormous amount of opacity in the Chinese DPRK relationship. One aspect which light has not yet been cast upon is the calculations that have been involved in China's new North Korea subsidy policy. For the first decade and a half of the post-Cold War era, to judge by mirror statistics by China's trade reports with DPRK, China's net economic transfers to North Korea remained within a very narrow band, maybe $250 million to $500 million. China was the donor of last resort. When aid from the rest of the world was going up, China's aid went down. When aid from the rest of the world was going down, China's would go up. That's completely changed since 2005. And now China is regularly in a situation where its net transfer of resources is in excess of $1 billion a year to DPRK. Traditionally, DPRK has been much more interested in transfer of resources from abroad than in total trade turnover. It has the northern version of what the late South Korean scholar Han Byung-jun used to describe as the mendicant mentality of the South before its turn towards export orientation. Now, what exactly is entailed in the calculations of this continuing enormous subsidy to the DPRK? It's hard for anybody outside, really, at this point to tell. Does it give the North Korean government some reason to pay attention to Chinese largesse? Of course. But the North Korean government also is not exactly inexperienced in playing off foreign donors. And ideally, the North Korean leadership might like to have two large foreign donors to play off against one another the way the game used to work with Beijing and Moscow. I think that ideally, perhaps from a North Korean standpoint, it would be Washington and Beijing both giving resources to Pyongyang and Pyongyang calibrating between them, but Washington has been too stupid to understand that this is their role in this game so far.
Yes, Mark?
I would focus on looking at some of the opportunities that are coming online for the Chinese, but the first point that I would mention is that in China, the rise of different groups. So if you look at the groups that are involved in some fashion with different parts of North Korea, but predominantly in the border region, you have the CPC International Department, you have the provincial party officials, you have SOEs, provincial SOEs, you have private Chinese companies, and you have PLA. But on the last point, the PLA, it's not to say that this is going to lead to a new military alliance. It's that just as the North Korean economy is militarized, the PLA has very strong economic interests on the Chinese side. So they have enormous capabilities in that area as well. The interesting convergence point right now is that when Deng Xiaoping launched the economic reforms in 1979, he told the PLA and the military, you're the last in line. We need to focus on light industry, consumer products. And we also saw the effort to divest PLA interests in the economy, Hu Jintao's last task before he became president or general secretary. In North Korea, the military is first. And so as we see now the PLA rise and kind of assume what they view as the first type of position, there's a very interesting institution alignment in the commercial aspects of it, PLA Industries, KPA, state trading companies. That's a part where rather than this type of leverage or hammer, you're actually looking at commercial opportunities. The last point that I would mention is that if you look at the natural resource statistics, they're pretty phenomenal. Musan iron ore is estimated to be the largest iron ore mine in Northeast Asia. North Korea is cursed by sitting on huge deposits of the world's worst coal. The anthracite is very dirty, burns a lot of sulfur, but there's a lot of it. And for energy-starved parts of landlocked Chinese provinces, it's a very important energy supplement, in some cases a main source. And in already a country like North Korea with electricity scarcity and shortages, that phenomenon is getting worse because whatever the North Koreans can mine, they're shipping to China. So the hammer, I don't see these different Chinese actors seeing a hammer or leverage. I think they see money, and I think they see unique opportunities that didn't exist before.
Thank you very much, sir.
Cha Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. First, Professor Kim, thank you for your comment. And your project is quite comprehensive and convincing. But you have lots of work to do. First is this, mass education. How do you proceed? And after you heard Dr. Park's presentation, would that give you more hope in your project? And Dr. Park, I assume that you have made this presentation to the U.S. policy maker. How do they receive your presentation?
Okay, Professor.
And also, as your perception, what's the U.S. policy on the Korean reunification? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kim.
Actually, we have a lot of mountains to go over. Even though I don't propose Project WWICS. Last 50 years, we tried hard, very hard. We are starting point now. Even though we run very fast, now look backside and we are starting point. What I'm saying is, as much as we run, I want to go further. That's the project management. That's the program management. We need a manual we discuss, deal with. We use those kind of knowledge. We can set up that some kind of metrics. How much we go, how much benefit we get. Then we have a vision. If we have a vision, we are not difficult. There is no vision, we have very difficult. We are the same situation without vision now. I want the vision for the next generation. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, Dr. Park.
Sure. So your first question about how U.S. policymakers respond to this type of presentation. I think U.S. officials are focused on two things, sanctions and preventing future North Korean provocation. And so with those two priorities, on the sanctions part, I think one way to characterize the officials are two groups. One group that believes that sanctions are working, but it'll take more time. Then another group that believes sanctions are actually not working, but it's an important coordination mechanism. And it's a very important political signaling. So it does have its utility, but not in the specified way that it was originally designed to. And then on the provocation part, my observation is that there is a focus on testing and implementing a theory, a thesis, that if you negotiate and sit across the table with the North Koreans, they're less likely to carry out acts of brinkmanship or conduct provocations. And so an effort to do more and more of these exploratory talks. So you're trying to focus in trying to get the six-party talks restarted and denuclearization back on track, but the immediate priority is to implement that theory of trying to prevent future North Korean provocations through a dialogue mechanism. With respect to what the U.S. policy is on unification, there are references to it in the U.S.-South Korea Joint Vision Statement, this idea of democracy and market economy. But the details beyond that, as you can imagine, it's very scenario and context contingent on how it pans out. But I think when you look at all of the effort right now, it's on the nuclear issue. Then that turns into a debate of, is the U.S. priority denuclearization or non-proliferation? And there are a host of arguments for both. But supporting unification, but with priorities elsewhere.
Thank you. Any other questions? James?
James Person, I spearhead the North Korea International Documentation Project here at the Wilson Center. I have a question for Bob. Given this profound sense of mistrust toward multilateral organizations, what do you think the prospects are of the six-party process? I mean, especially given the history of that the North Koreans have had with so many of these the members of this process. You have, I mean, you could say it's all of the bullies from North Korea's perspective. You have all the bullies in the playground saying, "Look, we've grown up, and now you need to fall in line. You need to become a grown up like us. And you have to give up any thing that would prevent us from bullying you in the future." This is what you see in a lot of these documents. I mean, the North. What do you think are the prospects then for the six-party process, given this mistrust of multilateral organizations, number one, and the profound sense of mistrust toward China, toward Russia, toward the United States and Japan?
Yeah, Professor Colin.
I think the six-party talks are deader than a doornail. That doesn't mean that the multi-party process of engaging North Korea is dead. I think North Koreans, they had four-party talks before. They know how to operate in that environment. They know how to utilize it to their advantage. We continue to operate on the myth that it can be 5 against 1. And they know very well that they can work the angles, and that's not their problem. Six-party talks is not the same sort of a threat to them in terms of manipulating their, internal decisions. They cooperated with Quito for a long time and were true to their obligations, specifically to Quito, and they learned to work with a multi-party partner. And that was very hopeful, and may have helped them, for example, make decisions to move ahead with Kaesong. So it's not that they're opposed to dealing with a multi-party partner. It's as long as that multi-party partner doesn't believe that it has extraterritorial powers within North Korea, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Han over there.
My question goes to Nicholas and Bob. You mentioned that the North Korean leaders are very reluctant to engage international economic cooperation, given the past history. And that reminds me of one episode that when we were going through financial crisis in 1997, North Korean economists told us not to go to IMF for bailout. This is time for South Korean brethren to seek for independence, not to subordinate to the international organization for help. This is a time, historical time, they said. So I said to them, mend your own store. But this reminds me of, is there any hope for Kim Jong-un, who got education from Switzerland? And is he different from his father and grandfather in thinking about economic cooperation with the external world and going for openness and reform.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
You may speak first on the Swiss.
Thank you, sir. Professor Han, you ask a question which can't be answered at this point, and in trying to think about how to approach it, one observation I'd offer is to suggest that there, in fact, is a world of difference between the economic viewpoint of Kim Il-sung and what we see as the economic viewpoint of Kim Jong-il. And you can, if you have the pleasure of spending many hours and weeks reading the collected works of these two leaders, you can see some of these differences quite clearly. If you go through Kim Il-sung's works, where he discusses questions of socialist economic management, there's a lot of what everybody's familiar with and a lot of the thinking which has contributed to the economic disaster of the modern North Korean economy. But at the same time, there's also an awful lot of commentary which is quite economically rational, which is a lot like what you might think of as a peasant cunning, peasant rationality. If you pay people more, they'll work harder. If you make more expensive products, you should sell them for more money. Basic pragmatic economic thinking is in there. As far as I can tell, in combing through Kim Jong-il's published writings, pragmatic economic rationality has completely been airbrushed out of it. There's not a shred or hint of pragmatic economic rationality in anything that has ever been published with Kim Jong-il's name on it. Quite the opposite. Instead, there is the warning that if you pay people more, they will develop a bourgeois mentality, and this will lead towards the end of socialism. Or if you agree to make one reform, which he will call a concession, that concession will lead to 100 more concessions, and then to the end of socialism. So we see very big differences in thinking between father and son. Is it possible that there will be another big difference between father and son in economic thinking? We'll see.
Professor Colin?
It's worth remembering that even though the numbers are small, the North Koreans have sent out a number of students to learn about international economics and international banking, that they are inviting people in to teach them about it, that the Europeans have regular classes and find very eager students who don't seem to be concerned about an ideological blade, resting on their neck if they ask the wrong question. So there's some sort of ferment at the lower levels, and this comes out of an education system which is apparently generating this sort of intellectual openness, which we wouldn't normally expect. So we may yet be surprised. I don't have quite as dismal a view as Nick does of Kim Jong-il's economic views, and therefore I agree with him. We got to wait and see with Kim Jong-un. But in any case, there is already in train this effort to learn from the outside. In fact, one of the big North Korean slogans these days is, badly translated by me, with your feet on the ground in your own country, look out at the rest of the world, meaning observe and take what is good from the outside, even though you put it in our context. So we'll see how far that develops. Well, right. Anyway, the euro is not doing too well these days, so.
Thank you, lady over there.
Thank you. I have two questions for Dr. Park. The first one is concerning the lots of capacity building that has been observed that is going on, being provided by the Chinese side to North Korea. Considering the fact that China itself is still, I think it will be a fair statement to say that China is still on its way of developing more sophisticated management capacity itself, building up its own management capacity itself, especially perhaps on the public sector side. And the focus of developing the management skills by the public sector entities is quite different from the focus by the private sector entities. Given that, the substantial level of capacity building efforts being provided by the Chinese partners to North Korea, could there be some unintended, undesired aspects or benefits from, in a way, too much of a one-way or excessive capacity building efforts? Maybe I shouldn't say excessive at this stage, but that's one question. And second question is, I cannot imagine the Chinese entities that are engaged in investing in North Korea, in the mines and others, actually putting in cold cash to North Korea. Have you observed any particular financing arrangements, any arrangements that are involved with the Chinese-led development projects in North Korea? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So your first question, I would just qualify that. Not so much capacity building that's taking place. My observation, it's more institution building, an effort to build up the Workers' Party of Korea. Because, frankly, the Workers' Party of Korea under Kim Jong-il has been secondary to the military until very recently. And so the effort to do that type of institution building seems to be very important if China wants to carry out some of these very ambitious economic development projects. You need to have a functional partner on the other side. And the fact that they look a lot like the CPC, I think, helps in terms of that kind of coordination. So it's like organizational behavior reasons. With respect to the unintended consequences of this type of institution building, one aspect of one of the characteristics of loosely what I term Beijing Sunshine Policy is that, excuse me, North Korean state trading companies are doing more activities in China. And so it's not to say that everything that these North Korean state trading companies are doing is illegal and they're involved in illicit activity, but it can show how this focus of more of these North Korean state trading companies doing business inside of China introduces another element of how money is being sent back to the regime. So this is in comparison to the other kind of remittance flows of North Korean workers in different parts of the world sending money back. The North Korean state trading companies that are in China are some of the more sophisticated ones. And I think when you look at that type of institution building and more of these entities having access on the Chinese side, I can't point to anything specific, but this notion of unintended consequences, they certainly are, I think, are on the horizon as well. Looking at your question about it being very hard to believe Chinese companies investing in North Korea, there's a long list of Chinese companies who in previous times have tried to invest and do business in North Korea in a host of different sectors. And there are many of these bankruptcy cases or cases where these companies have lost their investment and whatnot. But I think what's different right now is rather than investment per se, it's the actual bringing in the capital and bringing in the machinery to do the activities. So if you look at the physical evidence, how do you explain transportation infrastructure that is existing right now? And the fact that there's more electricity coming in, these aren't reports, these aren't rumors or speculation. In some cases, if you do look at satellite imagery at nighttime, it's not as bright as Pyongyang, but you see pinpricks of light in these areas where these natural resource development projects are going on. So it's that type of activity where I would frame it as more of an extension of the economic development activities happening on the Chinese provincial side, and those activities now radiate into the North Korean side for the priorities of further development of the natural resources.
Thank you very much. No more questions will be received from the floor. Are there any additional comments to be made from the podium?
I'll make a simple one. When Kim Jong-il went to China, I think at least 2 of those times, he spent a lot of time in the Northeast. And he made a specific point about Kim Il-sung's revolutionary activities in Northeast China, and in many ways suggested, I think, symbolically, that Northeast China remains an extension of the Korean Revolution. Therefore, dealing with Northeast China is not like dealing with a foreign country. It's sort of part of the ethos of the Korean Revolution, which puts it under a different heading in terms of North Koreans who want to go in there and operate, because in effect Kim Il-sung's ghost is smiling down on them as they, earn money.
Thank you. Any other comments? No? How about you, Nicholas? No. Once again, I thank our 4 distinguished speakers for their valuable contributions, and I also thank all of you in the audience for your contribution and patience. So are there any announcements to make? Yeah, thank you very much. The meeting is concluded. Thank you.